In the days since the pandemic has ebbed back in national attention, we have very consciously moved forward with a campaign against U.S. use of sanctions. But even this has now changed globally. The war in the Ukraine, the brutal NATO expansion into the Ukraine, the arming and weaponizing of the people in Ukraine, the firing on the Russian population in Ukraine, all of this created a crisis that could not be avoided.
According to Sanction Kills, an international campaign organized by many peace and justice organizations and activists, including Sarah Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and Li Xuhin, to criticize Western countries using sanctions as weapons against the world. Sanctions are essentially the imposition of arbitrary measures creating inhumane economic hardship on a targeted country. Sanctions from the United States affected a third of the world's population, imposing more than 8,000 measures on more than 40 countries. Economic sanctions are also known as embargoes.
The U.S. effort to impose and to get all of the European Union and Britain to go along with the sanctions was to cut the trade relations with Russia. A very different thing happened though, and that is the rest of the world refused to go along with U.S. sanctions because they were still able to trade with China and have economic relations and exchange. And so sanctions on Russia and now new, even extensive sanctions on China are not succeeding. The people of the world increasingly are deciding to do what is in their own interests. They have a population to feed and they need food, fertilizer, technology, and they can't get that from the West except by onerous conditions that are an assault on their sovereignty. So we have produced a new book, which is an anthology looking at the both difference that exists now and also looking at sanctions as a weapon that is used again and again against. There's a whole study of the impact of US and UN sanctions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, on Iran, on still today the continuing sanctions on Syria, and so on. But the more than 40 countries is a real theme that we take. The number of countries that are impacted affects a whole economy regionally. So we're trying to explain this to working people here, that these sanctions come back, they boomerang onto the economy here with increasing inflation, recession that really people are coping with in the layoffs and in an intensely fragile economy.
Sanctions, a wrecking ball in a global economy, is a book with several dozen writers, including Sarah Flounders, Margaret Flowers, and me. Comprehensive analysis against Western sanctions against other countries. The impact of sanctions on more than 40 developing and formerly colonized countries, countries 1/3 of the world population, was barely discussed in mainstream media for decades.
The book invited dozen activists from the Americas, Asia, Middle East, and Africa to discuss the devastating impact of US sanctions on other regions. With Margaret Flowers wrote Sanctions Kill Toolkit to understand the history of US sanctions and why we need to be against it.
I think a necessity for the workers' movement in the US to explain to working people that racism, that bigotry, that attacks on another country are not in their own interests. And this really helps to combat also the anti-China sentiment that is being consciously whipped up every single day by the media. It's used to justify the new rounds of sanctions on China, whether it's in chips or whether it is in cotton from Xinjiang. Every form of US policy is to intensify and to justify sanctions. And we feel that this has to be combated within the United States. This has to be explained again and again. The books are one way, the webinars are another, the demonstrations and rallies are still another. But it's important for working people to have their own voice in this, and not only the voice of corporate power.